Well, when Kirsty wrote to me and said, would I come and give a talk here, I thought, at last. Never given a talk in Hull, and I've never particularly given a talk in the same constituency as Alan Johnson. So is he here tonight? Well, that's a pity. We've never debated publicly. For some reason, he's always too busy. Anyway, it's good to be here, and I waited 9 years for this opportunity, so thanks. So here's the title of my talk, Sense and Nonsense, Science and Nonsense in Current Drug and Alcohol Policy. And I'm going to take you on a tour through some of the worst excesses of stupidity in terms of drug policy, and hopefully show you ways we can begin to remedy and be more reasonable in the future. So a few words about who I am. I'm a psychiatrist with a name like Nutt. There weren't many careers in medicine. I've been a researcher for about 50 years. Are some of you struggling to see the screen? I see your eyes are closed. Is there a way is that because that light's so bright above you probably? Is there any way we could turn that light off, Kirsty, in the middle? Thanks. It's just it's going to be quite hard if they have their hands out like this all night. I went into medicine to help, largely to do research and to try to improve and develop new treatments for brain disorders. So I've been successful in that. I've written a lot of papers. I've worked in the US and Australia, but mostly in the UK. I've had 4 children. Thankfully, they're all through the teenage years, so I've seen a lot of the excesses that teenagers engage in. And, of course, the reason any of you know of me was because I'm the ex-government's drug advisor. For 9 years, I was the chair of the scientific committee of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, and I conducted a whole series of reports on drugs that you know, like ketamine and GHB, etc. And I was so good at that, they promoted me to be chair of the whole committee, the Advisory Council. And that's when I started to have interactions directly with ministers, like the Home Secretary and the Drugs Minister. And at that point, basically, I didn't last very long. I got sacked because I couldn't stop telling the truth, and they didn't like it. But of course, that was a really dumb thing to do, because sacking someone gets an enormous amount of publicity. So the debate about drugs has gone from being something that actually was really quite marginal in Britain, and certainly scientists didn't talk about drugs and drug harms, to being something in the kind of the centre of public discourse, which is why I'm here, because people know about it or heard about it and want to learn more. So here's the image from the week. This is me being sacked. There's Alan Johnson's hand over my mouth. The key point about this cartoon is the fact that the scales of justice here are quite accurately representing what the realities in Britain are. I was saying that beer and fags actually are more of a problem than these strange green chemicals in these bags here. And here's the book of Cannabis falling from my hand. And I was arguing that actually cannabis was less harmful than alcohol. And that was just really not a discussion that the government wanted to engage in. And they thought by sacking me and shutting me up, it would all go away. But of course it hasn't. Largely because it's very difficult to shut me up, as you'll discover. But feel free to go and get another beer if you want. And secondly, that the field has moved on. And the evidence and the science behind drugs is growing stronger and stronger. So it's very hard. In fact, it's impossible to keep science at bay forever. The interesting thing, at that time, this is 2009, I was arguing that this was less harmful than this. And now I know I'm right, and I know I'm right for a number of reasons, but the most important reason is this, because Obama now agrees with me. And this is a remarkable statement. Marijuana is no more dangerous than alcohol. In fact, he went on to say it's less dangerous in young people. And the reason he said that is worth reflecting on, because at that time, about 200 million Americans had, by virtue of their constitution, which gives the states control over health, 200 million of the 350 million had access to medical cannabis. But cannabis was then, and still is illegal under American federal law. And those of you who've seen series like Breaking Bad, how many of you have seen Breaking Bad? I mean, one of the greatest pieces of art ever on television. But you know about the feds, the DEA, the feds. The feds were destroying pharmacies so that because the drug was illegal under federal law. And Obama said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to have a civil war against medicine, which is what was happening. So he basically banned the feds from destroying the pharmacies for this reason. Marijuana is no more dangerous than alcohol. Now that's a remarkable statement, actually. It's the first time an American president has ever told the truth about drugs. I mean, if I'm being cynical sometimes, I say it's the first time they've ever told the truth about anything, but that's a harder claim to defend. Anyway, we now all agree, Americans have got, but we don't have medical marijuana until very recently, because we don't have devolved decision-making about health. Now, one of the things I discovered to my horror when I started working in terms of drug assessment, drug harm assessment, is that neither in the UK Drugs Act nor in the United Nations Conventions on Drugs is there a definition of what a drug is. And that means drugs, the decision about drugs is an arbitrary decision. It's made essentially by politicians, which was the point of Kirsty's initial comment. You know, alcohol is a drug, but not if you happen to run the United Nations. And that's a real problem for scientists, because you know, a drug is a drug, and scientists should say, I think. So one of the problems is that the drinks industry has been very clever at defining what a drug is. A drug is something other than alcohol. Say no to drugs, that is the way you have more time to drink. And this is such a powerful argument. You've got to try it out on your friends. Maybe when you leave this room, you go home, try it on your parents. Say, where have you been tonight? Mum, I went to hear this guy Nutt speaking. Say, oh. What do you say? He had this strange idea that alcohol was a drug. And they'll look at you and say, well, what have you been taking? What was he giving away? No, you say, seriously, you know, is alcohol a drug? And most people over the age of about 55 will say, of course it's not a drug. And you'd say to them, well, why do you drink it? It changes the way you feel. You get drunk, you can fall over, you can vomit, you can have a hangover. How can it not be a drug? And they will say, almost completely, 100%, they'll say, if it was a drug, it would be illegal. And that illegality paradox has been developed by the drinks industry extraordinarily efficiently. So they have now eliminated all competition. There's alcohol and there's drugs, and there's a gulf between them which is inseparable. Whatever the word is, unbridgeable, sorry. But alcohol is a drug. Alcohol kills people. I don't know how many of you realise that Amy died of alcohol poisoning. No, I didn't. When she died, I assumed she'd taken some combination of drugs. I knew she was a heroin addict. I didn't know she was an alcoholic, actually. But it turns out when the coroner's reported that it was just alcohol. She had been an alcoholic and a heroin addict. It was the alcohol relapse that killed her. And she was in recovery. She was in this strange state of defined recovery. She'd been 6 weeks clean, or as drinkers say, dry. And when she relapsed, she drank a litre of vodka. She got a blood alcohol level of 450 milligrams %, which wouldn't have killed the average alcoholic. But because she was in recovery, she'd lost her tolerance. So just like heroin addicts die when they relapse, say after leaving prison, because they've lost tolerance, alcoholics die because they've lost tolerance. And recovery without any support is actually, in some cases, just a prescription for death. In fact, 3 young people a week in this country die of alcohol poisoning, often on their 18th or their 21st birthdays. So I would say this. I would say a drug is a chemical which, when taken, produces physiological changes. Those are changes in body organ systems. Now, what we're talking about when we're trying to develop drug laws and control drugs, we're usually talking about physiological changes which are pleasurable. So people take drugs largely because they get something from them. Eventually, they may take drugs because they can't stop. So all those of you who are smokers know that. You know, mostly you're treating your withdrawal. But for most drugs, people get some pleasure. But of course, there are harms as well. And this balance between the harms and the pleasure is the critical argument, I think, in terms of what policy should be. And that's a very difficult debate to have, because currently we discover that actually underpinning drug laws are moral positions. And they're rarely discussed, but because there are easy arguments for people to win, because moral positions actually don't really, and they're not very, when you expose them to the light of day, you find that they tend to wither away. So governments and policymakers hide behind exaggerated health harms in order to maintain the status quo. Now, there are many different ways in which drugs can harm you, and this is perhaps the most important one. They can kill you. So these are the latest UK data on the number of deaths per year from drugs. So there's tobacco, over 80,000 deaths a year. Still the biggest killer. Half of all smokers die of a smoking-related disease. It takes 10 to 15 years off the life of people who smoke a lot. But these are what economists call good deaths, because smokers are make an amazing contribution to society, because they pay a lot of tax, cigarettes are expensive, and they die just before they can draw their pensions, so there's no drain on the state. So these are called good deaths. Alcohol, 28,000 premature deaths. These are not so good because these range across the whole age spectrum, and a lot of them are young people. And these completely overshadow opiate death. Now, opiate death took a huge hike last year. I deliberately didn't put the numbers up here because I just thought I wanted to emphasize this enormous increase, the biggest increase we've ever seen in heroin and opiate deaths last year. And there are two reasons for that. One is we don't have any treatment services anymore. And the second is this, is that we now have super potent, ultra strong heroin and fentanyls, which have hit the market. And the latest data in Britain came out 2 days ago, showing now there's 75 deaths last year from fentanyls, of which 27 are from this drug called carfentanil. Now, carfentanil is the ultimate terror drug because it is so potent that the drug dealers cannot weigh it out with accuracy. So it's impossible to know what dose you're getting. And there's been an explosion, particularly in the States. Half of all heroin deaths in the States are from fentanyls, because fentanyls are very much cheaper to make than heroin. I'll come back to that in a second. Paracetamol deaths about 200, cocaine, all-time peak of over 400 last year. And then amphetamines, cannabis, ecstasy, and methadone, virtually none. So the hysteria around drugs, which often centres on cannabis and ecstasy, is almost inversely related to the harms of drugs. Just a few, I just want to show you the comparative potency of heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil. Carfentanil is over 1,000 times more potent than heroin. Unfortunately, it's much easier to make. You don't have to grow opium. You can make it from chemicals. You can import it from China. As I say, you can't weigh it out. So we're going to see that, we're going to see this. We're going to see carfentanil killing people and other fentanyls. Last year, 40 different fentanyls were discovered in Britain. It's going to be the big problem. And it's going to change the way I think we think about drugs, because if you can't see it, but it can still kill you, how can we protect people against it? These are the data that came out at the weekend on drug deaths around Britain, and you've got quite a lot here. Here you've got nearly 55,000. 55 per 10,000 in the last 20 years. So that's quite high. It's higher further north, and it's even higher in Scotland, where they have twice the number of deaths that they have in the northeast. But you have a lot of deaths here. And that relates to several factors, one of which is that treatment facilities are not good, and secondly, you probably don't have a good rollout of the antidote naloxone, etc. So just as an example of what is happening, this is a young man. He died in 2016. The coroner's report came out in November, about a year later, November 2017. It's a big problem that it takes a year to get a report on deaths like this. But anyway, eventually he goes off to score some cannabis in Maidstone in Kent. And his dealer says, "Great, I've got some new E. Would you like some E?" And he says, "Sure." He takes the E with the cannabis. But the E wasn't E, it was fentanyl, and he's dead. And we don't know whether the dealer knew it was fentanyl or not. Probably didn't. We don't even know if the guy that sold to the dealer knew it was E or fentanyl. We don't know. But we have to think differently now. If these drugs can kill people so rapidly, the very least I think we have to do is think about how people can be allowed to test for what they've got, so that they don't actually take fentanyl when they're thinking they're taking it. But the drug that a lot of you are drinking tonight is the one that's most likely to kill most of you, and that's alcohol. So here is this most chilling statistic. Alcohol now is a leading cause of death in men under the age of 50. It's overtaken suicide and road traffic accidents and cancer. And because women are drinking more than men, because they're earning more than men, and they're actually empowered to some extent more than men, it'll be the leading cause of death in women under 50 within a few years. So we have a sort of tidal wave of alcohol-related deaths in young people in their working age. And we have seen it coming. And this is perhaps the most unfortunate, most disturbing graph that I'm going to show you tonight, because it shows willful negligence by the government and by the NHS. So these data here are what are called standardized mortality rates. I started in medicine here in 1969, and the government started collecting data on the likelihood of dying from a whole range of different disorders. You can't see them, they're all here, but they include heart disease, diabetes, cancer, endocrine diseases, etc. And they started collecting this data, and it's normalized, so if it goes down, less people are dying. And you see all these go down. In the last 50 years, we've reduced deaths from heart disease by 50%. We've reduced deaths from diabetes by 50%. And that makes exactly what you'd expect, because medicine's getting better and you're getting healthier. You've got Clean Air Acts, etc. So isn't it strange that deaths from liver disease go in the other direction? And you might say after the first 5 years, well, this could be just a statistical blip. Well, maybe after 10 years, it's still a statistical blip, although you've doubled them compared with heart disease. By 20 years, it's obvious that there is a rise in deaths from liver disease, and 80% of those deaths are due to alcohol. So what did the government do here? It started allowing supermarkets to sell alcohol. And the death rate then doubled again in the next 10 years. So we saw it coming, and we ignored it utterly, completely. And it's outrageous. And now we have some of the highest death rates from alcohol in the world. One of the reasons Brits die young from alcohol is they start drinking young. So these are the data, the longest data. It goes back to 1995. So we've got what? We've got over 20 years of data collection on the drinking habits of young people. And it shows half of all 15 to 16-year-olds are drunk once a month. And being drunk once a month puts you in some risk of things like accidents, crime, unwanted sex, sexually transmitted diseases, pregnancy, etc. You notice actually nothing's changed in the last 20 years, except women have got slightly more likely to be drunk than men now. But we've seen it, we know it's there, and we've done nothing about it. One of the things we say is, what can we do about it? How can we stop young people drinking? Well, it's very difficult. But, you certainly don't want to criminalise young people drinking. But on the other hand, they don't have many alternatives, and that's one of the reasons I think they do. So based on those kind of data, about 9 years ago, I was starting to do this before I was sacked and carried on afterwards. I started doing a very sophisticated, detailed assessment of the harms of different drugs. It turns out that there are 16 ways in which a drug can harm. 9 harms are to the user, and 7 harms are to society. And we looked at 20 drugs, and it took 2 days to do a detailed analysis of these 20 different drugs, ranking them on these 16 different variables of harm. And we then pulled them together, and out came this graph. And that was a bit of a surprise to me, because no one had ever done anything as sophisticated before, so we hadn't any real estimate of what might happen. But it turned out that alcohol is the most harmful drug in the UK. And that's because of the size of the red bar. And the red bar is the harm that alcohol does to other people. Alcohol is way the most damaging drug to people who don't drink. Because each of you who pay tax, if you pay as a normal rate taxpayer, pays about £1,000 a year of your tax goes simply to support the drinking that happens today in terms of police costs, in terms of hospital costs, etc. 3.5 billion NHS costs, 6.5 billion police costs, over 20 billion in lost opportunity costs from hangovers, etc. Alcohol is responsible or involved in over half of all domestic violence, a large amount of child abuse, a vast number of traffic accidents, etc. Alcohol is not the most harmful drug to the user. The most harmful drug to the user, I think, here is crack and crystal and heroin. The size of the blue bar tells you that. But they're not so much used. So in Britain today, the health burden of alcohol is the largest. Over here, we've got drugs like buprenorphine, mushrooms, ecstasy. They have almost no harm to society, and relatively less harm to the user than alcohol. But these are the drugs that are vilified, and alcohol is a drug which we can still advertise on TV. We've got rid of tobacco advertising, but you can still advertise alcohol. Because the drinks industry is so powerful, it corrupts politicians in very sophisticated ways. And it corrupts newspapers, and it's almost impossible to have a public debate about the harms of alcohol in this country. What about cannabis? This is your man. This is Alan. And this is me in the spliff. You can tell by my moustache. And these are the other scientists that Kirsty's mentioned. It's not quite accurate, that cartoon, because it wasn't actually a Class A drug at the time. It was it was a Class C drug. But government didn't like it being Class C. The Daily Mail wanted it Class B or A. And Alan Johnson was angry with me, so he sacked me. So, now, cannabis has been the whole history of cannabis regulation is a total history of politics trumping science. And the argument goes cannabis is a dangerous drug, and therefore we have to ban it. Okay, so let's just look at some of the pieces of evidence that support that. This data covers the same time period as the rise in deaths from liver disease from alcohol. You remember there was about a 4 to 5-fold increase in liver deaths over a period of 40 years. That increase in liver deaths through alcohol was associated with just a doubling of consumption in the population. Just a doubling. Over the same time, cannabis consumption, or the number of people using cannabis has gone up 20-fold, 20 times. And therefore the amount of cannabis has probably gone up at least that, maybe more. Now, if cannabis was a really dangerous drug, and it was causing illnesses, you'd presumably see some with that massive increase in use. But actually it turns out it's very hard to find any harms from cannabis. I showed you there are almost no deaths. So why are people scared about cannabis? And the great spectre that was hung over society was the spectre of schizophrenia. Cannabis causes schizophrenia. Well, it doesn't. Here's the data we pulled together in a series of publications from the government's own data set. This is the Medical Research Council's database on the prevalence of schizophrenia and psychosis, the incidence and new cases of schizophrenia and psychosis in Britain over that time course where this massive increase in use might have been predicted to have turned into an increase in the number of cases. And there are no increases. If anything, it's going down, probably because some forms of cannabis actually treat schizophrenia. But this was the argument, and this is still almost the only argument that people are prepared to make about why cannabis is illegal, even though it's wrong. But those of you who've got a family member with schizophrenia, you kind of want it to be right, because you want to have some insight into why they've got the disorder. In reality, it's almost certainly a combination of genetic and other factors. It's not cannabis. But that hysteria has led to the drug continuing to be banned. That's the justification for why the drug is illegal in this country until recently. And of course, the strategy is actually nothing about really health. It's about controlling populations of people that politicians and the police don't like young black men who have this tremendous over-representation of cannabis convictions, despite the fact that they don't use any more cannabis than young white men. So this is the cannabis lobby the anti-cannabis lobby is essentially a political lobby driven by the right-wing press and largely targeted at ethnic minorities. It didn't used to be like this. Cannabis was a medicine in Britain until 1971. It's probably the oldest medicine in the world. It's been found in Egyptian mummies' tombs 4,000 years ago. And it was a medicine until 1971. Queen Victoria, she wrote about it. She said it was a great benefit for period pains and for the pains of childbirth. And everyone was happy. The Queen's physician wrote the definitive text on how to use cannabis as a medicine back in the Lancet back in 1890. But in 1971, it was banned. And the argument went like this. There were two GPs in Ladbroke Grove in London who were prescribing cannabis as a medicine and telling people to use it recreationally. And the American government did not like that. The Americans had banned medicinal cannabis in 1934. And they were irritated by us because we hadn't banned it. And they pressurized us and they pressurized us until in 1971 we did ban it. Of course, what we should have done was ban the doctors for misprescribing. But instead we banned the drug. It must be the only drug that's been taken out of medicine by an act of parliament. I mean, how could MPs possibly decide on that? But they did. And so it's not been a medicine since 1971. And that's been pretty problematic for people in whom it's a good medicine. And the Americans have got it back, and the Spanish have got it, and the French have got it, and the Belgians have got it, and the Dutch always had it, and the Germans have got it, but we haven't got it because the Daily Mail won't allow politicians to bring it back. And this is where we are now. Not only don't we have it, we wage war on people who might grow it and use it in a rational sense to help treat their disorders. I get emails like this on quite a frequent basis. Ex-teacher in her 50s, long-standing multiple sclerosis, she's in a wheelchair, only cannabis provides relief. Front door smashed down 3 times in dawn raids by the police. Now she's in a wheelchair, they rang the bell, she just kind of stagger or drive to the door and let them in. But the war on drugs is a great excuse for police to dress up in paramilitary gear, to get a lot of overtime, because they're getting up at 4 to smash the door down in the dawn raid, and to smash doors down. And it's a perfect day for them, Get overtime and smash the door down. And it's completely irrational, utterly disproportionate, and I think an obscene waste of my taxpayers' money. But it happens. And now she's got 3 convictions, and if she gets convicted again, she goes to prison. British law says 4 strikes, you must go to prison. So her life is in the hands of the police. And actually there aren't almost any prisons in Britain which are even wheelchair accessible, so she's going to be in a very difficult position. But does this make any sense? Who are they protecting from the cannabis? She's only the person using it. But of course she's an easy target. And the police can tick off their arrests, etc. So this is outrageous, and it's actually even more outrageous because until 2005 you could argue the defence of necessity. This is a defence which is embedded in English common law for about 400 years, which says if you have to commit a crime to prevent a greater suffering, you're allowed to do that. And people were protesting. People who were getting arrested for growing cannabis for their ailments were saying that I have to have cannabis, it's the only thing that worked. So what did the Labour government do in 2005? What did the law lords do? They banned the defence of necessity, but only for cannabis. So the good news is if you're stopped with your crystal in your pocket, you can say, I need it for my headaches, Gov. And you could plead that in court, but you can't plead cannabis for anything. And magistrates, any magistrates here? Magistrates hate it, because if the police bring them to court, they are already convicted, because they can't plead anything else. So it's an outrageous act, and it was brought in by a Labour government. Interestingly, things have, in the last couple of weeks, have changed. Here's Billy Caldwell. You've all seen the Billy Caldwell story. So this is a guy with severe epilepsy and possibly autism. We don't actually know whether he's autistic because it's impossible to assess him because he's having so many seizures. In fact, his life is one long seizure until his mother took him to America and got him cannabis oil for his epilepsy. And his seizures went down. She started him on cannabidiol, and his seizures went from 800 a month to 5. And he started being able to walk and talk, and actually she began to wonder whether he really was autistic. Maybe he actually was just confused by the drugs he was on and the fact he was having seizures all the time. And then she added in some THC, a sub-stoning dose of THC, and he stopped having seizures. He didn't have seizures for 300 days. And she came back to Britain, and she lives in Northern Ireland, and she persuaded her doctor to prescribe cannabis oil. He started prescribing cannabis oil. The kid was fine. And what happened? The Home Office went and told the doctor if he prescribed cannabis oil anymore, he would be prosecuted. Why? Because it's an illegal drug. Well, so is morphine and heroin, but we prescribe those. Yes, but you'll be prosecuted anyway because there's no license. Well, actually, that's not true. So the doctor stopped prescribing. So she went back to Canada. She got cannabis oil in Canada. She came back through Heathrow, and she declared it. This is the medicine which saves my son's life. And they confiscated it. And 3 days later, he was in intensive care at St Thomas's Hospital in London, having permanent seizures. And it was the fact that the kid was on the verge of dying, that eventually made the Home Secretary give in. And now Billy has got a license to have cannabis, as have 2 other kids with these severe epilepsies. Now, there are 2 things I want to say about this. It's great. It's great that cannabis is now a medicine in this country. It's bad. We have no idea how to get it. Currently, it seems like you've got to go to Canada or America and get treated, and then come back and say you've been treated, and then you'll be allowed to have it, which is, of course, absurd, particularly for the people who don't have parents like Billy. There are 200,000 people with severe epilepsy in Britain locked up in institutions, having fits on a daily basis. None of them have ever had access to cannabis. 200 of them die every year from epilepsy. Some of those will live if they were given cannabis. If you think back to since we started knowing that cannabis was anticonvulsant, which was about 15 years ago, thousands of people in this country have died because they haven't been given access to medical cannabis. I think this is a health scandal worse than Shipman, worse than Gosport. This is an outrageous insult to people's lives, simply to defend a policy, a politically driven policy, that cannabis is... The government's been lying. The government has said consistently it has no medical value, even though it knew and we knew it did. And I think they should be made accountable. I think it's outrageous what's happened. And beyond the deaths, there are tens of thousands of people with disorders like epilepsy, Crohn's disease, PTSD, Marfan syndrome, who could have benefited from the appropriate use of cannabis, and they've all been denied it or been forced to do it illegally, simply to perpetuate the lie about the harm of the harms of cannabis, so it can be kept illegal. Now you might say, well, that's all very well. We're going to have medicinal cannabis, but what should we do about recreationally? Should we just let anyone use cannabis recreationally? And I say yes, but as long as they're adult. And then they say, well, what about the kids? What about the kids? I have a solution. I have a solution to the kid problem. It's called the Eton solution. Okay. This was David when he was a kid at Eton. Cameron. Anyone remember Cameron? Did he? He probably never came to Hull, did he? Too scared. Yes, I don't think so. And this is Josh Astor. These were together at Eton as teenagers, and they were caught smoking cannabis. So here, there's the date. June 1982. And the story is this, is that the kids, 10 kids in the house, were going off into the East End of London to buy UB40 records, and they're coming back with some dope in the bags with the records. And they were listening to Bob Marley, etc., and smoking dope. But because he'd only smoked and not sold the drug, Cameron was not thrown out. Instead, he was fined. He was gated, which meant he was locked in Eton. He couldn't go out at the weekends to the tea shop. And he was given a Georgic, which is a large chunk of Latin poetry to write out. Now, I don't actually know what was in the lines of Latin, but I think it should have been this. nil fumari cannabis. I mustn't smoke cannabis. Now, it seems to me that is a completely appropriate level of punishment for teenagers who smoke cannabis when they shouldn't. 500 lines of that would put them off until they go to university. Very interesting story. It's a kind of almost a controlled experiment, because of those 14 kids, was it? How many was it? No, 10 kids. 7 boys were expelled, including Astor. 5 were suspended, and 4 were gated. No, it was So in the end, it was 16 kids. What's fascinating about those kids is Astor, who was even more privileged than Cameron, has had a life that many people have when they're expelled from school for drug crime, which is a life of drugs. And his life has been very damaged by his drug use. Whereas Cameron was kept on. And as the headmaster said, Cameron was the most difficult boy I've ever taught. And of course, then he went on to Oxford and then to be our Prime Minister. And it's very difficult to know whether that was the right decision by the headmaster, wasn't it? Really hard to know that. But the sad thing, of course, is that when Cameron became Prime Minister, he would never, and we tried very hard to get him to change policies, not to expel kids from school who possess cannabis at school, because it improved their life. If he'd been expelled, he wouldn't have been Prime Minister. That headmaster made an enormously important decision, which could actually end up having ramifications through things like Brexit today. There's another angle to this, and we mustn't ignore the fact that the police quite enjoy drugs because drugs bring interest in the police. This was one of the most kind of surreal phone calls of my life. I was in Barcelona giving a lecture on psychiatry, and I got a phone call from CNN. Now, I'd done an interview with CNN about 3 days before on methadone, MCAT, meow meow. And they rang me up and said, "David, where's Scunthorpe?" And I said, why do you want to know where Scunthorpe is? How? Because the Humberside police have called an international press conference to tell the world that they believe 2 young men had died from taking meow meow, MCAT. And it was a kind of completely bizarre conversation. Well, it seems to me that's almost implausible, because literally just a few months before, the Israeli government is an Israeli drug. They put out their report, 460,000 young Israelis had used methadone, not a single death. It's pretty unlikely that 2 kids in Scunthorpe are going to die from the drug on the same night. In fact, they haven't died. They haven't died from this at all. They've been drinking very heavily, and they actually ended up walking out into the town and taking not methadone, but methadone, which is huge, very, very toxic, with alcohol. But if the police had put out a press conference saying 2 young men died from being drunk and taking an opiate, CNN would have just said, well, we're 8 in Detroit last night, so why am I going to go to Scunthorpe? But if you say a new drug that's named like a cat, you can get the world's press to you. So the police can't quite like this. And this is the worst thing. They dragged this lad's father out, and he was weeping as he urged youngsters to avoid the drug. I don't want him to be labelled a druggie, because he wasn't. He was just on a night out with friends, enjoying himself, a normal, caring, hard-working dad. Now, every word in that sentence in red is true, but one, and to make it easy for you, I bolded it. He was a druggie. He was an alcohol druggie. He was so drunk, they'd been in about 5 bars. He was so drunk, he didn't even know what he took. And that's why he died. And what the father should be saying was, don't get drunk and then take drugs. Don't use the alcohol drug and other drugs together. And in fact, the post-mortem showed there was no methadone. Methadone hadn't killed anyone when it was made illegal. But the election was coming up, 2010 election was coming up, and Mr. Johnson wanted it banned because he thought it would help Labour get back into power. It didn't, but it got banned anyway. Now, the banning of methadone turned out to be one of the most amazing natural experiments, maybe the most amazing natural experiment in the history of this country. And these are the data. What you see here, the black line, are deaths from cocaine, and the red line are deaths from amphetamines. Okay, so methadone is a kind of weedy amphetamine. Okay. When it hit the market here in 2008, it was legal, perfectly legal. You could just buy, go into your head shop, buy, you order it on the internet, pick up the phone, they come around in half an hour. A gram of methadone you could buy, it was a couple of quid. But the great thing is it wouldn't kill you. Whereas a gram of cocaine or a gram of amphetamines would kill you. So what happened here was that people switched from cocaine and amphetamines to methadone because it was legal and safe. And look, deaths from cocaine fell precipitously. The availability of methadone probably saved 300 or 400 lives who otherwise would have been lost to cocaine and amphetamine. But then it was banned, and for a short while there was the deaths carried on going down because we're stockpiling. The head shops had loads of the stuff. But then, of course, they ran out. And people had a choice then. Well, they didn't have a choice. There was no methadone left, so you go back to cocaine. And then look, cocaine deaths up. Last year, I haven't had a chance to change the graph. It only came out 2 days ago. 432 deaths from cocaine, the highest ever. If we kept methadone on, these would have disappeared. But the hysteria to ban drugs, and to ban every drug, means that if you've got no choice, you may as well go for the drug that has the best boost, the best effect. And if they've all got the same criminal sanctions, people go for cocaine and amphetamine rather than methadone now. But this is an example of how safe drugs save lives, and we should learn from it. Well, that was all pretty bad, but then it got worse. 2016, May the 27th, it's etched on my heart alongside my wedding anniversary. Britain did something that no other country in the world has ever done. It banned substances which don't exist. So now we've gone into a kind of different dimension. We're living in Monty Python world. Any substance which could affect your brain, whether it exists today or could exist, is illegal de facto. I talk to friends overseas, they say, you must be mad, that can't be true. This is true. Completely true. Under the Psychoactive Substances Act. Now, why have they done that? Well, they did it largely because it was just easy. They thought it was easier to close head shops by doing this than it was to actually ban the drugs that head shops were selling. And to some extent, that's true. They've closed about 40% of head shops. But they haven't got rid of dangerous drugs. People have actually gone from the rather harmless drugs that were being sold in head shops to drugs like fentanyl and to cocaine. But now everything's banned. And I just want to talk you through, this is an example of how the media distort thinking so much that politicians of every party, every single party apart from the Greens, signed up to this, believing the lies that they've been told through the media. So the drivers were head shops and also nitrous oxide. Now nitrous oxide is, for those of you who don't know, it's called laughing gas. Laughing gas, I'll tell you the history of it around for a while. But the Sun was desperate to get nitrous oxide banned because soccer players were using it. Now, soccer players are not stupid. They realise that a balloon of nitrous oxide will affect them for about 3 minutes, whereas getting the same intoxication from alcohol will affect them for about 30 hours. So it's quite sensible. You want to play soccer the next day, you have a balloon of nitrous oxide, have a bit of a whiz, rather than get drunk. So the footballers were using this to maintain their performance and all having fun. But if you run a campaign to get rid of laughing gas, even your granny will say, well, that's stupid because I had laughing gas when I delivered you, or your dad. So what did the Sun do? They changed the name. It went from laughing gas to hippie crack. Now, and that's enough to scare anyone, isn't it? Hippies coming back, tie-dyes, flares, crack. And of course, newspapers do what they like. They just invented it. I challenge them every time they write it now. I say it's nothing like crap. But this is a way of scaring people. Nitrous oxide is a very UK drug. It was discovered in the UK by Priestley and Davy. It was Davy, president of the Royal Society, our most eminent chemist ever, discovered more elements than anyone else in the world. Used nitrous oxide to have fun, because it was all right to have fun in those days. In 200 years, there'd be no deaths, except for suicide, a few suicides. It was used by Coleridge and Southey when they couldn't get opium to get their visions. Millions of women for childbirth. I had it a couple of years ago when I broke my wrist. It's just a standard treatment for mild pain. And even Prince Harry used it. That's okay, because, he's not going to play football the next day, is he? But soccer players are absolute targets for the sun. Let's look at the comparative harms of these two drugs, nitrous oxide versus alcohol. Nitrous oxide, 1 or 2 deaths a year. Swallowing the balloons a danger. Alcohol, about 5,000 deaths a year. Other harms very low. Why ban it? Why ban it? It was banned because the Sun wanted it banned. So this is the true absurdity of this situation. So here's Raheem Sterling, who was their major target. He's taking a balloon of nitrous. And here's Luke Shaw with his leg broken in Basel playing in the European Cup. And when people are carried off on football pitches, they say, oh, look, he's been given oxygen. That's not true. That's at sea level. You don't need oxygen at sea level. He's been given nitrous oxide too. So nitrous oxide is good for him, bad for him. I don't know. The point is, it's absurd to think that this drug should be banned just because this man was using it. But that's what they've done. And I'm fighting case after case now of people who are potentially going to prison for using a drug that is way less harmful than alcohol. It makes no sense to me at all. Where did this all come from? It all started back here in 2003. This is the younger May. This is the one where she was planning her future. She's chairman of the Conservative Party in 2003, and they're out of power. And I remember this. I remember her saying this at the time. I didn't kind of put it together as part of a slide talk. But I remember her saying, we must escape the image of being the nasty party. And there's one word in that sentence that is a problem. It's the image. She didn't say we've got to stop being the nasty party, did she? No. She said we've got to stop people realising we're the nasty party. And they were pretty successful. They got back into power. They're still in power. Although they've joined up with an even nastier party across into Ireland. And this is what she says now. Now I'll stop you having fun, even if it's harmless. Because that's what they're doing. Nitrous oxide is a safe way of people having fun. Her father was a priest, and as the daughter of the church, she means this: thou shalt have no other drug but me, which is alcohol, forever and ever. Amen. And actually, it also comes from the attitude of other senior Tories. This is what's called the Bullingdon Club. Have you seen the film The Riot Club? Yeah. It's a great film. It's like a documentary on young Dave. Here's young Dave. He's on the steps of the Soldonian. He's wearing his outfit, which costs about £3,000. And he's saying the proles, that's you and me, are complaining we'll ban nitrous oxide. And there's Boris, next Prime Minister probably. He says, let no snort coke. It was good enough for us. Why do you want to bother with nitrous? No. And these were a very interesting group. I mean, in order to drink as much as they did, they used to take a lot of cocaine so they could stay awake and drink. And, some of them stop when they get into Parliament, some still carry on. But the point is they don't get arrested. If you've got enough £50 notes in your back pocket, you never get arrested. And to them, drug use was what you did and got away with, but they're quite happy to see other people punished for arbitrary reasons. It's extraordinary classist as well as irrational. I would say this is the worst law ever. It's immoral because it pushes people to use alcohol. Now, if you go to festivals, you've got to drink, and the drink's very expensive there. It'll increase harms and deaths through the black market. It's based on lies, which is a bad thing to build a law on. It's anti-scientific. When they first brought the Psychoactive Substances Act out, we said, well, where's the provision for research? And they said, what's research? And we said, well, that's what scientists do. You're at the Home Office, Big problem in this country. The drug laws are vested in people who are policemen. And they're nearly as bad as postmen. This is the worst law since 1559, when the Anglican Church was founded, and they decided to kill Catholics because they didn't believe in Protestantism. They're both moral laws. They have no appropriate scientific or ethical standing. And we now need an enlightenment. I've talked about cannabis and the value of cannabis in different disorders to some extent. But many illegal drugs, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, they also have tremendous potential in a whole range of medical disorders. In fact, methadone was developed by David Nutt in the States as a treatment for addiction. And I showed you it reduced cocaine deaths. It actually could be a treatment for addiction, but it'll never be developed because pharmaceutical companies won't develop drugs which are illegal because the regulations add to the cost enormously. The international conventions on drugs, they apply in over 197 countries in the world, and they are the most oppressive laws in the history of modern world. They're equivalent to the slavery laws or the laws which say that women can't have the vote, etc. They're arbitrary laws which deny people access to freedom, liberty, and health. And in some countries, they actually don't even have painkillers, opiate painkillers, because it's easier to comply with the regulations than actually to provide medicine. They also censor research. All these drugs are put into Schedule 1, which means it's almost impossible to research them. And they've actually produced, in the last 50 years, they've almost stopped all research on these drugs. And that's the worst censorship of research in the history of the world, actually. But some of you might say, well, that seems a bit extreme. The only example I can think of that's remotely as bad is when you go back to 1616, when the Catholic Church banned the telescope. And the censorship was for exactly the same reason. The telescope was banned because the Catholic Church did not want people to know that the earth was not the center of the universe. They didn't want people to know the truth about the heavens. And these drugs are banned because the UN doesn't want people to know the truth, that these drugs are actually not as harmful as they say, and much more useful. If you want to read about it, I've written a freebie you can get that. And I just want to finish by saying we're fighting back. This is an article I wrote a couple of years ago. We've achieved it. It was in the last month is a major breakthrough. We now have medical cannabis. We don't know how to get it, but they cannot prosecute you for having it, which is great. We've been doing medical studies. We've done in Britain now, in Bristol, where one of my group works, we've started the first MDMA trial for alcoholism in the world. 2 MDMA therapy sessions to help people overcome the traumas which lead them to drink. We also did the first ever imaging study of ecstasy with John Snow on Channel 4. And this was a very interesting program because it was the most watched scientific program in the history of Channel 4, but it also led to a fascinating interchange in Parliament the next day. So this man here, Jim Dobbin, was an MP. Of course, he was from Lancashire, so he's obviously not a very good MP, but he said this: what licenses were held from her department, this is the Home Secretary, for the drugs used in the recent Channel 4 documentary on MDMA? What is the process for revoking such licenses? And how would this process be initiated? So here's an MP trying to stop scientific research because he doesn't like the fact we're using a so-called illegal drug. I find it absolutely terrifying that this person could have any authority and any power in making any decisions whatsoever in this country. Luckily, he didn't succeed. He didn't ban our research. But in practice, the research is almost impossible to do. It takes 2 years to go through all the regulations to do a single study. But we've been fighting back. We've done the first LSD imaging study, the first psilocybin depression study. And we're also trying to develop a safer alcohol. I'll just say a few words about magic mushrooms. They've been around for millions of years. 1 million people in Britain take them every year. They've never killed anyone. And it turns out that they turn off the part of the brain which causes depression. And for that, it was doing this brain imaging study that revealed this phenomenon, and that led us then to write a grant to actually do a trial in clinical depression. And it turned out to be very, very difficult. It took 32 months of a 36-month grant to get all the permissions because this is an illegal drug. It cost £1,500 a dose. I had to have a special license, I have to have a special safe. I can write a prescription for heroin as a doctor, but I have to have a special safe to store my cannabis and my psilocybin. And when I say to the Home Office, why do we do this? They say, well, it's to protect the public from you, because you might go and sell this stuff on the street. And I say, even £1,500 a dose, not even in Chelsea am I going to get anyone buying my psilocybin. It's absurd. But these are just regulations which have been built up with from a completely arbitrary base. The effects are fantastic. Half the people who'd had resistant depression They'd failed on at least 2 drug treatments. They failed on CBT. Half of them got almost completely well within a week. And some of them have stayed well for months. It was a remarkable study, perhaps the most powerful study in resistant depression ever done. And now we're rolling it out and trying to use it in different countries around Europe to prove that this wasn't just a strange phenomenon that we did down in London. But this could have revolutionised healthcare, but it's so difficult to do. And even if it does work, and we find we can replicate this in other studies, it's still not going to be prescribable by doctors because it's still an illegal drug. So the battle that's being won with cannabis will then have to be fought for psilocybin or MDMA, LSD, etc. And as I've intimated, we could replace alcohol. Alcohol was the second largest killer in the world. 3.5 million people a year die of alcohol, 6 million die of tobacco. Modern science would allow me to replace alcohol. I've invented alternatives which are as nice but much, much safer. But when I go to investors, they say, this is brilliant, you're a genius, David. I say, yeah, I know, my friends tell me that too. No. Why can't, what's the catch? I say, there's no catch. And they say, okay, but suppose the Sun says that a footballer was caught using Arcosynth and they demand it gets banned under the Psychoactive Substances Act. What will you say? And I'll say, well, we'll go to court. And they say, well, I'm not going to invest in anything that's going to be decided by a jury. So Arcosynth will be developed, but it will be developed in China and America by us. It won't be developed in Britain because our drug laws make it so uncertain for investors. I don't want to finish. This is the quote that when I started working for the government, it was over 20 years ago, when MDMA first started killing people, they brought me in to help guide them as to how we could minimize harms. So that was about 1994. And I thought, I know we don't have a constitution, but I thought there were principles that the British establishment worked on. I thought this was the principle. In a freedom-loving society, no conduct by rational adults should be made criminal unless it's harmful to others. I realise now that's not true. That isn't the basis on which our society or our government's obeyed, but it should be. And I think we should all campaign through Truthjuice and other organisations, the Green Party, and any party that will actually be rational. We should campaign to make this the principle. And if people are using drugs and not harming others, then they should be allowed to. And for those of you who don't follow me on Twitter, please do. And those of you who haven't bought the book, there's one man in the book. Put the book up. Where's the book man? He's brought it. It's signed. It's not expensive. It costs about £10 on Amazon, and all the proceeds, which is about £1, goes to my charity, Drug Science. And yes, if you follow me, you'll see all the things we do over the next few years trying to make progress in this field. Thanks very much.